Thank you. Well, welcome everyone to this HNES consultant seminar. Um, my name is Louise Singleton. I'm the program manager at GemServe for HNES, the Heat Network Efficiency Scheme. Talk you through the agenda. I'm just going to move this over. Oh. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a brief overview to start with around the sort of policy landscape and the other schemes that exist within the heat network landscape. We'll then give you an introduction to HNES. Some of you may have attended our introduction to HNES seminar a couple of weeks ago, so apologies, there might be some repetition there, but for those of you that weren't there, it's probably useful to give you a bit of an idea of what the scheme actually is.
Louise, apologies. It looks like your screen's gone black. Can you still see it on your side?
Yes, I can. Let me stop sharing and I'll start again.
That's great.
Is that better? Fab. Okay, so yes, so we've then got some HNES key points. So just kind of takeaways to remember, really. And then in the second half of the session, we're going to be going into more of a deep dive into the optimization studies part of HNES. Predominantly because that's where we think the consultants will be supporting clients more. In the overview, in the introduction to HNES, I'll give you more of a breakdown of what the two elements are, but we're going to be focusing on the optimization studies, which is the revenue grant side of things, more in this session than the capital grant side of things. And then we'll talk about support and next steps, and then there'll be time at the end for a Q&A. So at that point, if you can unmute yourself, put your camera on, you can ask your question, or you can use the Q&A or the chat functions at the top as well. So if we don't manage to answer all of the questions at the end, we will be still jotting them down, and we can provide responses afterwards if that's required. Okay, so I'm sure many of you are familiar with this diagram. It basically gives you an overview of the Heat Networks Transformation Programme. So it shows the kind of history, I guess, behind the different heat network funding schemes from DESNZ. So we've got the Heat Network Investment Project, which launched in 2018, and that was designed to support the development of new heat networks. That's now closed to new applications and is somewhat being replaced by the Green Heat Network Fund, which again is supporting the development of new heat networks, but also supporting the transition towards low carbon heating sources within existing heat networks. We then had the HNES demonstrator, which ran from October 2021 to May 2022. That was really instrumental in shaping HNES as it is now. And so there'll be a lot of similarities for those that were involved in the demonstrator. There will be a lot of similarities between the two schemes, but there are some changes from what we learnt by doing the demonstrator. And then at the bottom there, we've got the more sort of regulatory side of things. So we've got heat network regulation coming in 2024, and we've got heat network zoning, which will be coming in from 2025 and is in development now. So we have had a number of people ask us what's the difference between HNES, HNU2 and GHNF. So HNU2, I should probably explain, people may be aware of HNU, which was the Heat Network Optimization Opportunities, and that was actually the precursor to HNES demonstrator, and that was solely focusing on essentially revenue grant style things that we're doing in HNES, but it's around these optimization studies. And DESNZ are currently in the process of procuring consultants for HNU2. So this diagram here just kind of shows as a client with or a heat network operator which route you might go down to get funding. So starting at the top, you've got a heat network that's got customer detriment, low efficiency, it's unreliable. They may need consultancy support. But they may not. So if they already know what the issues are, they might just want to go straight to a capital grant. If they want to replace their heat generator, then that would need to go down the GHNF, the Green Heat Network Fund route. If they're not looking to replace the heat generator, then they could submit a capital application into HNES. If they don't meet the GHNF criteria, then it may be that they want to submit an HNES capital grant, capital application first. So for example, if the heat network is really inefficient and has got a lot of problems, it might not be suitable currently for a low carbon heating source. So it may be that it would make sense to submit an HNES capital application first to improve the efficiency of the heat network, to then enable a GHNF application to be submitted. Otherwise, if the criteria is met, they can go straight to submitting a GHNF application to change their heat generator. Alternatively, if they are unclear at this stage what the issues are, they know they've got a poorly performing heat network, but they don't know why. It may be that they want to procure some consultancy support. If they're able to apply to HNES, then they can go straight to the HNES revenue application. But in some cases, that may not be available to everyone. And essentially the criteria for HNES2 is if there's emergency support required, if the organisation is in financial distress, if it's time critical and a fast response is required, or if there's insufficient resource for HNES, or they're unable to procure consultants. So, so that's why someone might go down the HNES2 application route rather than coming through the HNES revenue application route. So hopefully that gives a bit more clarity. But again, we can take questions at the end if needs be around the differences between the different schemes that are out there at the moment. So back to HNES. So GemServe has been appointed as the main delivery partner, and we're responsible for the overall scheme delivery. We'll be responsible for managing the application process, for the monitoring and reporting process, which happens once a grant award has been made, and also for comms and events like this one. We've partnered again with Ramboll, as we did for the demonstrator, and Ramboll are our technical partners, and they will be responsible for the assessment of all the applications that we receive and for providing sort of technical expertise around heat networks. And then new into the team for the main scheme is Turner & Townsend and LuxNova. So anyone that's familiar with HNIP or GHNF will be aware of the kind of pre-application support function that's available to help applicants understand what's required from an application and to help make sure the applications are of good quality. We've introduced that same function into HNES, so Turner & Townsend will be performing that role. So towards the end, we'll share sort of contact details and things with them, but predominantly they're going to be engaging with heat network owners themselves to really understand their project, because it's heat network owners themselves that will be applying. But in some cases, it might be that you guys as consultants might want to ask some questions as well. And LuxNova are there to provide legal advice, predominantly around the grant funding agreements and any questions that we might get around those kind of contracts. Okay, so to give you an overview to HNES, so there are three objectives of HNES. They're very similar to what we had in the demonstrator. But so the first one is reduce carbon emissions by making heat networks more efficient. So so again, that's the heat network efficiency scheme sort of implies that that's something we'd be looking to do. Within this round, or this version of HNES, there is a greater emphasis on customer detriment and reducing the impact that an inefficient heat network has on customers. Obviously, that's driven in part by the cost of living crisis as well, but we want to make sure that consumer confidence is improved so that people who have a heat network have a good experience, and we can get some good news stories out into the wider sphere, I guess, particularly in terms of helping to expand the number of heat networks that we will have in this country and we need in this country if we're to meet our net zero targets. So it's really important that heat network customers are positive about their experience. So we really want HNES to really help to improve that experience for existing heat network customers. And finally, number 3 is to help prepare the heat network market for sector regulation and technical standards. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a heat network regulator appointed now, so that will be Ofgem, and technical standards are being developed through the Heat Network Technical Assurance Scheme, HNES, and so that will be coming forward over the next couple of years as well. So we want to make sure that any poorly performing heat networks that are out there, their sort of delivery is raised, or their so that they are meeting the technical standards that will be coming forward shortly. So as I mentioned before, the funding that's available is split into 2 pots. So we have our capital grants and our revenue grants. So on the capital grant side, this is part funding, so up to but not including 50% of the total project cost, and that's available to actually implement measures. So to change pipes, to replace HIUs, to actually make tangible interventions that will really improve the efficiency of the heat network. And the budget pot for that is up to £30 million across the 2 financial years, 23-24 and 24-25. And then we also have revenue grants. So this is full funding for third-party support, so for consultants to come forward and to undertake an assessment of the heat network, identify where there are issues, and to provide the heat network operator with an understanding of what interventions could be made and the impacts that those interventions would have. And we'll talk a lot more about those later on. And the funding for this is up to £2 million across the same 2 financial years. It's worth noting that when a project applies, they are able to apply for funding across both financial years if they wanted to. But any funding that's allocated within the financial year 23-24 must be spent within that financial year. It cannot be rolled over into the following financial year. So anything that's not spent is essentially lost at that point. So it's really important to make sure that the work is on track and can actually be evidenced, and invoices provided to show evidence of spend before the end of the financial year, to make sure that the projects can actually benefit from the grants that they've been awarded. Okay, so who can apply? So applicants themselves need to be the operators of existing district heating networks or communal heating systems. You yourselves as consultants, you are not able to submit an application in your own name. You can support a heat network operator to develop their application form, but it has to be the heat network operator themselves that will be submitting the application. And that's because ultimately they're the ones that will they will sign the grant funding agreements. They're the ones that will receive the funding, which they can then pass on to yourselves as consultants. So it's really important that it's the heat network operator, the legal entity who has authority to sign off on the investment, that is the named applicant on the application form. Heat networks can be situated in England or Wales. So this is a change from GHNF, where that's just for heat networks in England. HNES does cover Wales as well, and we would actively encourage any applications from Wales to come forward. And we're looking at public sector, private sector, or third sector organisations. So this includes NHS trusts, universities, government departments. So it's quite a broad range of people who can apply. We have 8 funding rounds. Funding round 1 is currently open. The scheme launched on the 7th of February, and the closing date for applications is the 31st of March. And then you can see it's kind of quite sort of spread out for over the next sort of 5 funding rounds up until the 13th of October. We then have a break sort of over the Christmas period, and then we round 6 closes again on the 2nd of February 2024, and the final funding round is the 10th of May 2024. So yeah, so if if you are engaging with us, and we will be asking questions around which funding round you think your clients would want to be submitting an application for, to help us kind of plan out our pipeline and understand how many applications we're expecting in each funding round. But those are the dates for each of those. And then talking a little bit more about the eligibility criteria. So within a capital grant application, we would cover 4 categories. So we've got the energy centre and the plant room, the primary secondary distribution network, the tertiary network, and metering. I haven't gone into too much detail here about what's covered within each of those sections, because you can find a lot more detail in our guidance for applicants documents, which is available on the gov.uk website, and I would encourage all of you to go and read that document, because it has all the information that you need and your clients need to be able to understand the scheme and to submit good quality applications. So as Sam said, the slides will be available after the session. So there's a link to the document here, but yeah, it's on the gov.uk heat network site. But what won't be covered with a capital grant is any costs that have already been incurred before an HNES award has been made. Any costs that are unrelated to the heat network infrastructure, so for example, improvements to building fabric. Any costs relating to engagement activities, so we won't be funding stakeholder management, for example. In the energy centre and plant room specifically, we won't be paying for any costs for replacement of the primary heat generation source, predominantly because that would be covered by GHNF, and we would expect applicants to submit applications to GHNF if that was something they were looking to do. From a tertiary systems perspective, we won't be paying for things like radiators or any other heat emitters within buildings or dwellings. And finally, for metering, anything that is required under the heat network metering and billing regulations, so obviously anything that's a legal requirement already, we wouldn't be funding through HNES, as it's something that is already required and wouldn't be eligible for additional government funding. From a revenue perspective, so this is covering optimization studies. So there is an outline specification which is provided within the application for guidance for applicants document, and we'll go through each of these different sections later on in more detail. So I won't talk through these right now. But in terms of what won't be funded, again, any work that has already been commissioned prior to an application won't be funded. Any internal staff from an applicant, so for example, project management of you guys as consultants won't be funded, and anything to do with construction, operation and maintenance of a heat network won't be funded. So the revenue grants themselves are there really as sort of investigatory work to really understand why a heat network isn't performing very well. It's not there to help build a network or improve the operation of the heat network. That would be what a capital grant would be for, from an operation perspective under HNES, or construction potentially through GHNF. Okay, so some key points to remember. Got 4 here. As I've said, it's the named applicant must be the heat network operator, not the consultant, but you are still able to support applicants in completing their application forms. You just can't be the named applicants. We will not be funding multiple revenue applications by a single applicant where projects are considered similar. So where we think that the revenue pot for HNES this time around is significantly smaller than the capital pot at only £2 million. So what we don't want to be doing is spending that money on lots of very similar revenue studies that actually, if they're all submitted by a single applicant, they could learn a lot from doing one, potentially two if they were different, and then they could apply that learning to their other heat networks, potentially within their own portfolio or broader elsewhere to help other organisations to learn from the information that they've received. So if we receive multiple applications from a single applicant, we would immediately discount a number of them if they were deemed to be similar. Number 3, the work must start on a funded project within 3 months of signing the grant funding agreement or the memorandum of understanding. The main reason for this is that we want to make sure that we can realise the benefits of the funding as soon as possible. So within the kind of requirements of HNES from a DESNES perspective, there are a number of benefits that they want to realise in relation to heat reduction in heat generated or reduction in consumer bills, all that kind of thing. So they want to make sure that we can realise those benefits as soon as possible, and in particular ahead of the next heating season. So we want to make sure that any funding that is awarded is being spent as soon as possible. And this will be taken into account when considering a project plan or sort of evidence of deliverability as part of our assessment process. And again, as I've mentioned, the guidance for applicants document is really useful. So please read that document. There's a lot of information in there that's really helpful. As I said, it's available on gov.uk or actually on the GemServe website as well. So the link is there. Okay, so looking at revenue studies or revenue grants, the optimization studies in more detail. There are essentially 2 work packages that comprise an optimization study. So the first one is an assessment of the network operational performance, including reporting. And the second one is actually developing optimization opportunities for the network, and that will include reporting and recommendations. So upfront, we would expect your clients to be able to provide you, where possible, descriptions, drawings, schedules of their heat network to really help you to understand how it all works, what's in place at the moment. But we are conscious that a number of the projects that we will be looking to fund are the kind of most poorly performing heat networks, and they may be particularly old. They may not have this data available. So it's worth noting that that wouldn't preclude them from applying. It wouldn't. In fact, we would want these organisations to apply, so that we can really help them to understand what's going wrong with their networks. They might already have an idea of what their where they are poorly performing. So they might be able to provide you with quantified information around the sort of levels of sub-performance. So we'd want them to provide you that if they know them. They might not know them. The whole point of bringing you in is to help them to identify this. And any other project data as available. So yeah, how much fuel are they consuming? What heat demands are being taken off the system? What are their operating temperatures? So all that kind of information, we would expect, if they have it available, that heat network operators will be able to provide to you to help inform your studies. So work package 1, looking at network operational performance. So the idea behind this is to understand the current operation and condition of the heat network, to develop a baseline of where that heat network is at the moment, in order to then identify optimization measures and show the difference between where they are now and how much that particular measure will help to improve the efficiency of the heat network, which would be part of work package 2. So the outputs of work package 1 are that the heat network operator understands why they have a suboptimal performance in their heat network and what the impact of this is on their heat network and their operations. So potentially that's on the operation of the heat network itself. So things around amount of heat required to, or how amount of energy required to heat the heat network. But also on customers. So what impact does this have on customers? How many outages are there? Are they paying particularly high tariffs? So that's kind of what we want heat network operators to be able to understand from doing work package 1. So there are 3 steps to this work package, and I'll go into more detail of these on the next slide. So the first part is to actually analyze any data that the clients have provided to you in the first instance, or that could be gathered through temporary metering. So that is something that potentially we would fund as part of a revenue study. I should say within a revenue grant application, there is a proposed funding amount or budget, I guess, which is sort of £15,000 to £24,000, and we would expect that the temporary metering, if any was put in, would be included as within that budget range. We would expect you to undertake at least 1 site visit so that you can actually see in real life, I guess, the heat network, and really sort of dig deep into why it might not be performing well, and then produce a report about the site visit to confirm what you've seen, what you've observed, and to confirm the data that's potentially been provided to you, and how you see the heat network operating at this stage. So the second part of work package 1 is to baseline network performance and to develop some key performance indicators. So we would want you to propose and quantify any suitable metrics, targets, or KPIs for measuring operational performance. And any baselining that you do must cover assessment of the whole network infrastructure. It can't just be on one portion of it. It has to look at the whole network. There are a number of suggested KPIs listed in the guidance. So again, I would refer you to that. And the metrics can be calculated or they can be estimated as agreed with the client. So if the client's happy for estimated metrics, then that's acceptable. But obviously we would prefer calculated wherever possible. And then finally, for the third section, we would look at then analysing the network performance. So carrying out some degree of analysis on how the network is performing, producing a summary report to present your findings back to the client. So that will include what the causes are of the suboptimal performance, and any baseline metrics and KPIs, so that the client has a real understanding of exactly where they are at this stage, to then understand what impact any improvements could have. And where it's possible or relevant, it's always worth referring to external standards, any data, any guidance, or any sort of experience or any information that you've had from previous experience of working on similar heat networks that you can kind of refer to and compare to. Okay, so moving on to work package 2, this is the network optimization opportunities. So this is essentially taking the current state of play of the heat network and identifying any particular measures that might help to improve the efficiency of the heat network. And what we'd be looking for is for these to be fully costed, and the impacts of putting these measures in that they would have on the heat network, again, in terms of performance and in terms of improving outcomes for customers. So The output of this would then be that the heat network operator has a clear understanding, based on robust evidence and analysis that you've done, to produce a roadmap essentially of which measures they could implement, and how this could then improve the outcome of the heat network. So again, there are 3 steps to this work package, which I will go into more detail on. So 2.1 is the development of the optimization measures. So obviously from work package 1, you've got an idea of the current state of play. You then develop a long list of measures or package of measures. So it could be that you list out all the individual measures themselves, but actually if you combined a couple of measures, you might get better efficiency. So it might be that you would want to recommend that actually certain measures come together and shouldn't be delivered standalone. So we would be looking to improve performance from a technical perspective, a customer experience perspective, and potentially from a decarbonisation perspective. So as I mentioned before, if a heat network operator is looking to decarbonise their heat network, but they might not be in the right place at the moment operationally, then it might be that some of these measures that you would be recommending will actually help them towards that or further along on that decarbonisation journey to then be in a position where they could change their primary heat source. We then want these to be categorised into high, medium and low, based on whether the level of outcome, any impact that they would have, any disruption, and that categorization would be agreed with the client. So based on what the client sees as an acceptable cost or an acceptable disruption, what's the kind of impact of implementing these measures. And then quantifying this impact on the project metrics and the KPIs that you'd identified in work package 1. Part 2.2, so the next step is then looking at the cost and the cost effectiveness. So what we would want is fully costed measures. So obviously you've got your long list of measures. We really want to understand from a capital perspective, operational, replacement, design, the actual fully costed impact of these measures. And again, this should be based on actual quotes that you've received, or any other similar works that you might have worked on that you've got evidence for. So then there must be evidence behind why these costs have been put forward. And ultimately what we want then is a techno-economic analysis. And that would essentially show the costs and savings over the life cycle period, and the cost effectiveness. So that could be around payback, it could be IRR or MPV. And ultimately, with the output of this is that you get the client will get a spreadsheet that's unlocked, so they can see all the workings, all the calculations that have gone into it. They can really interrogate it further if they want, showing all the workings that you've put in to come up with this techno-economic analysis. So what we don't want is for it to be just the outputs, and they can't then, if they've said, okay, actually, what if we want to change we're happy to have a shorter payback. What if we change this? What impact does that have? We really want them to be able to interrogate this information if needs be, to change around with the parameters if later on after the study's finished they want to make some changes. They've got a workbook that they can use to make those changes. And finally, again, the output of work package 2 is that we would then take from that long list of measures that you've produced, a short list of recommended measures, outlining the impact on the project metrics and KPIs that we identified again before, and the rationale for why this particular measure was recommended over others. And we would then produce a techno-economic report, which covers both work package 1 and work package 2. And again, potentially it could include a pathway for decarbonisation if that's something that the client was interested in. And again, signpost to other sources of funding, which could be an HNES capital application, or it could be a GHNF application if needs be. So that's kind of the final report that the client gets. So on the next slide, okay, yeah, I'll talk you through these ones first, and then. So these are just some of the examples of the metrics or the KPIs that you might want to consider. And what we would expect as part of your report is for you to list all the KPIs. So these are the minimum that we would want to see, but there could be others around sort of flow and return temperatures or heat tariffs, for example. And we then want you to list out the baseline. So this is what's come from work package 1. And then the particular optimization measure or package of measures that you've suggested and the impact that would then have. So you can see the change from the baseline to then this particular measure would have a reduction of X, this would have a reduction of Y, this would actually increase this for whatever reason. Like so that the customer's got a clear picture of the impacts of the different recommended measures and how that compares with where they are now. So we would expect this table to form part of your report. So in terms of once the funding has been issued, so the client has signed either a grant funding agreement or a memorandum of understanding, there is a requirement for monitoring and reporting to be completed, and this is a condition of the funding. So this was something that was part of the demonstrator as well, and we've made some changes, mainly on the capital side. So M&R reports have to be submitted monthly, and that will cover an update on the progress of the project. So is it on track to deliver by the expected delivery date? If not, why not? Any risks and issues that have arisen as part of the project, and also the budget drawdown. So particularly that's probably more useful for a capital project where they might want to draw down the funds at different points throughout the project. So whereas with a revenue project, typically we see that the consultant completes the work, they submit the optimization study at the end, and that essentially is the evidence to us that the optimization study has been completed, and then the client can submit their grant request form, and we can then pay out on the evidence that the work has been completed. For anyone that's not a local authority, the funding will only be paid out after we've seen evidence of work being completed. So, for example, like I say, an optimization study, or in a capital project, it might be invoices for purchasing particular pieces of equipment. For a local authority applicant, they will actually be able to draw down the funds upon signing their memorandum of understanding. So there's a slight difference there between the two different types. But yeah, from a non-local authority perspective, we need to have evidence of spend before any funds will be released. So additionally then, for capital projects, we would also be wanting them to provide quarterly updates on the progress they're making against their benefits and KPIs. So within their application form, they have to list the areas of suboptimal performance that they have and the benefits that they are hoping to realise from the funding that they've received. So that's obviously really key for HNES to make sure that the funding that they have issued on a premise of realising certain benefits is actually on track to meet those benefits, so that it makes sure that the programme overall is on track to realise the benefits that have been set. So it's really, really important that we get projects completing these returns, so that from a budget perspective, we can make sure that the grant that's been awarded is on track to be spent. Like I said, in a particular financial year, if it's not spent, it's lost. So we really want to make sure that we're getting as much benefit from the allocated funding that we have and making sure that's going to projects that will be able to spend it. And then from a making sure that HNES is meeting its aims and objectives, we really need to have this information to see the real impact that the funding is having. it's really important from the M&R returns that we received in the demonstrator were a key part of the benefits case, I guess, for putting forward HNES main. So yeah, without that evidence and the impact to show what the funding had we wouldn't have been able to secure the funding for HNES as it is now. So it's really, really important that these returns are provided to us on a monthly or quarterly basis. And in terms of timing, so from a capital perspective, they are required to be submitted from the month after grant award through to 24 months after the project commissioning is complete. So obviously, while the project is being commissioned and the work is happening, we want to have the information on how the project is progressing and also any sort of early benefits that may have been realised as the project progresses. But then we also want to have 24 months of monitoring once the project has been completed so that we can see we've got enough evidence to demonstrate the improvements that have been made. And obviously it's covering 2 heating cycles or heating seasons. So we can really gather that compared to the baseline information that they will have provided, which again is an annual figures in most cases. From a revenue perspective, it's required from the point of grant award to the sign off of the optimization study. And within that final revenue M&R, there will be an additional tab or worksheet that we would expect you guys as consultants to complete. And that will essentially detail the outcomes of the optimization study, including any proposed measures and costs. So the benefit of doing this from a DESNZ perspective is that they're then able to uniformly compare the impact of all of the optimization studies in a kind of spreadsheet form. They can extract that information and then do some analysis off the back of that on the impact of the optimization studies and potentially if the measures were implemented, what sort of savings would be made, etc. So so that will be a condition of the sign off is that particular tab is completed by yourselves as well. So in terms of from a revenue perspective, we're looking at least 4 deliverables, potentially 5. So the first one is the overall project report, which relates to work package 2.3. We've got the summary site visit report from work package 1.1. We've got the techno-economic analysis spreadsheet from work package 2.2. And we've got this final worksheet from the M&R revenue return. And potentially as an optional extra, your client might ask you to help them complete a HNES capital grant application form. So based on the recommendations that you've made in the revenue study and the optimization study, you may then want to say, okay, brilliant, we know we want to press ahead with these measures. So we will now submit a capital grant for the next funding round to implement the measures that have been identified. So, but obviously that's an optional requirement. It's not necessarily needed. Okay, so that's a quick run through, I guess, of optimization studies. In terms of support and next steps, so I can't stress enough, please read the guidance for applicants. All of this information is in there in more detail, so please do take a look. If you have an inquiry about the scheme or if you'd like to be added to our mailing list, which I'm imagining most of you are if you're on this event, but please email hnes@gemserve.com. And then finally, I wanted to signpost you towards some optimization guidance videos that have been published by DESNZ. So these were issued again on the 7th of February, and they cover 8 different topics. They're short videos, and they're designed to identify particularly sort of common issues that heat networks might face. And help organizations to it's that part around sharing and disseminating knowledge from existing heat networks that other organizations or other heat network operators might find useful that might be applicable to their own heat networks. So again, the link is here. They're available on the Heat Network part of the gov.uk website. So again, it's worth having a look at those and informing any clients that you have that they're there as well, because they're very useful. In terms of key dates for different things that are coming up, so there is an event on Friday, which is being hosted by Guru Systems, which is looking at sharing some findings from the HNES demonstrator. So there are a couple of projects that are speaking about their experience of the demonstrator and what they've been able to achieve from the funding they received. There's also a joint event being hosted on the 22nd of March between GHNF and HNES, specifically targeted at the NHS and sort of applications from that sector. So if you've got any NHS clients that you think would be interested, or you want to attend yourself, again, please email us at hnes@gemserve.com, and we'll be able to point you in the direction of the Eventbrite. Sign up for that for either of those two, essentially. And it's worth just highlighting again the closing date for funding round 1 for HNES is the 31st of March, Friday the 31st of March. So please, if you do want to, if you've got any clients that are looking to submit an application at that point, you'll need to email hnes@gemserve.com, or they will, to request a SharePoint space to be able to submit their application form into. If you want a copy of the application form, again, email hnes@gemserve.com, and we'll be able to share a copy of the capital and the revenue application form as necessary. But your clients will not be able to submit an application into us unless they have requested prior to the closing date a dedicated SharePoint space. And once that's set up, we will share with them the specific link to their own unique site, and they can then drop the application form and any supporting evidence into that folder. And that's essentially how we are accepting applications. So without a dedicated folder on our SharePoint space being set up, your clients will not be able to submit an application. So it's really important that no later than a week before the closing date, they've requested an application space. And again, they can do that by emailing hnes@gemserve.com. Right, Sam, back to you.
Thanks, Lou. We've had a few comments and questions. So the first one, Peter will take that away in terms of timescales, and we'll consider it internally before we respond to that directly. There's a question from Thomas around any particular software that we'd recommend for the techno-economic analysis. I think the answer is there's a number of bits of software out there. It will be very much dependent on a case-by-case basis, and it's if you're unsure, it might be worth speaking to a consultant in that space. Lou, I don't know whether there's anything you wanted to
Yeah, no, that's fine. I don't think we have any particular software that we would recommend. Like as you said, Sam, there are a number out there. So yeah, if it's yeah, I would suggest, as you said, speaking to a particular consultant to see what they would use. Yeah, we wouldn't necessarily recommend any particular one.
Right, and then we had a request for the videos, which I've posted in the chat. Question around information on HNE2 online. Do we have a link to information on that?
So HNE2 at the moment, I believe, is currently under procurement. So essentially, the DESNES are procuring a number of consultants to be on the framework, essentially. And then once the consultants have been appointed, then essentially it will be open for applications. So I don't believe it's open at this stage in terms of applying as a heat network operator. But if you're a consultant, I believe it came out on the Helga framework, and I can see that Joel has put his hand up. So Joel, you can talk about this because it's your thing.
Yeah, I thought if I listened in for long enough, I might be marginally useful. So yeah, thanks for the question. You did a pretty good job. Yeah, so exactly that. In fact,
Your microphone's gone a little bit quiet, Joel. I don't know what happened there.
Sorry,
it was okay, and then say again.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's better.
So the procurement through Helga is now over. So we've now got our responses. So we're waiting to go through that. I would say for most heat networks, your default place to go is HNES, not HNU2. If you run into any trouble or for whatever reason can't access HNES, then send an email to it would actually be really helpful to send an email to the HNES team, and then they'll forward it through to us. So we just keep all the correspondence in the same place. Failing that, you can also send it to Heat Networks at phase.gov.uk. But as the at phase is going to change soon, I would stick with the at GemServe email address, and then we can deal with whatever our email addresses become in the near future. So sorry to give the extra work to the GemServe team there. But yeah, basically, if you're a network and you're in trouble and you need some help, you don't really know where to go, then get in touch. But otherwise, generally apply for HNES. Because what we could do is we could sort of point consultants at your project, at your site, if you need help. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you very much.
Brilliant.
Great, thanks, Joel. So a few more questions. So one around how much data would be needed to support a capital grant application. Are you looking for 1 year, or is more data required?
1 year, I guess, is acceptable, but obviously the more that we have, the better. Obviously with 1 year, depending on how what year that was or different things, it might not necessarily be a typical year. So obviously more is more, I guess, in this situation. So yeah, if Georgia, I can see you put your hand up as well, so I will let you jump in on this one.
It's only because I had the same question and the clarification process with Sam. So I think the answer is from a technical assessor's point of view, yes, the more is better. Like we don't want just 1 year if it's possible, just because might be issues in that year, like if there are some missing data, for example. It would be better to have an average of a few years. But on the other hand, we don't necessarily need to see all the data at the point of application, let's say 10 years. What we're more interested in is doing something with the data, not just providing the data, but actually process them and identify, like, what does this data tell you in a way? It tells you that it's inefficient in this area and this so that's what you will be scored at, not just the data, because obviously all the inefficient schemes might not have the same availability of data, but we want to see how you process the data tells you in a way. And yeah, and I think I'm sure Joel or based HNES might be in touch after. Please make a comment if you can provide more data, like let's say you can provide 10 years worth of data, because we might be interested once you get funded to ask for that. But yeah, you don't have to provide all that at the point of application necessarily. Hope that helps.
Yes, thank you, Georgia.
Thank you. And a couple of other questions. So one, would the installation of new secondary pipework be covered by HNES?
Yes, so that is one of the eligible measures in the primary or secondary network would be replacement of pipework. So yes, that is something that could be funded.
And if the project has 2 phases for capital, but it is the same applicant and the same district heating scheme, can phase 1 be included in the capital application for 23-24 and the next phase to be in 24-25?
Yes, I imagine so. So I mean, again, it would be worth in this instance, I guess the applicant speaking with our relationship managers just to really understand the nuances, I guess. It might be that we would recommend that actually you submit 2 separate applications potentially, but it is possible to, and I guess it would be how dependent is the second phase on the first phase, and if the first phase ended up changing, would that have an impact on the second phase? So it's kind of a bit of a depends on the sort of specifics, I guess, of the application, but potentially yes, you could say actually we need this amount of funding, and we would look to be drawing this particular amount of funding down in the first financial year and this second amount in the second financial year, and it would be useful then to understand the dependencies on both. But I recommend in that particular instance, or for any project that has specific questions, to reach out to our relationship managers. So you can do that by emailing hnes.support@gemserve.com, or if you use a generic hnes@gemserve.com, it will get through to them as well. We can forward it on. So, but yeah, if your clients have specific technical questions about or specific questions about their application, it's worth having a more one-to-one discussion with our relationship managers.
Thanks, Louise. And I think we're just about up for time. We have had a question around contingency and how that's covered within capital costs.
Yes, so we will be publishing further guidance on how to handle contingencies. So we're just finalising that at the moment, and we'll be providing that. We're aware that there are potentially requirements for contingencies, particularly if we're looking over longer time frame, people applying for funding in the second financial year. But yeah, we will be publishing further guidance on that shortly.
Thanks, Lou. And I think the final one here is around monitoring and reporting requirements. Is it on a monthly basis and then quarterly as well? And how do the 2 different reports?
Yeah, so from a monthly perspective, so for capital, yeah, you would still be required to submit an M&R form every month, but on the quarterly, so every 3 months essentially, we would ask you to provide additional information. So monthly, we would be expecting you to provide information on your project progress, your any risks and issues, and your project spend. Or your budget, how you forecast how you're going to be drawing down the funds. And then on the quarterly months, in addition to that information, we would want you to provide information on how you're performing against your identified benefits and KPIs that you submitted in your application form. And that would still be split into the 3 months of that quarter. So we'd still want that information on a monthly basis, but we're only going to be asking for it to be provided on a quarterly basis. So for example, for January, February, March, for January, you'd submit information on how your project is progressing. February, you do the same. And then for March, we would then ask you to provide all of that information plus your performance on your benefits, specifically for January, specifically for February, and specifically for March as well, as an example.
Thanks, Louise. So I think we're out of time to answer any more questions. I know there's a couple more that have come through. We will pick those up and distribute answers to all of the questions that have been sent through to us today. If there's anything that you haven't managed to ask, or if anything crops up as you're reading through the guidance, please do reach out to us. As Louise said, I will pop the email address in the chat as well. Thank you all so much for coming along. It's been great to see so many of you here today.